Okay, we got a few people here, so I guess we'll get started. And if anybody comes in late, they'll just miss it a little bit. I did want to let everyone know that feel free to chat, use the chat box as much as you want for whatever. If you want to talk amongst yourselves or make comments or ask questions, and I'll try to monitor the chat while I'm going through some slides here. And if I see a question pop up, if you have a question, if you could put the word question or put all caps or something like that for questions, something that sets it off to where I can maybe notice it if it starts getting too much in the chat there. I guess we'll just go ahead and get started. This is the webinar on closing the loop on soil fertility. I feel like this is a really important topic because, well, there's can be a lot of issues. Let's just go ahead and talk about first what closing the loop actually is. What is a closed loop system? A closed loop system for homesteading aims to mimic natural ecosystems by integrating different elements such as crops, livestock, and soil management practices. It's a closed loop system refers to a sustainable and self-sufficient approach that minimizes external inputs and waste. And I think that's really important, and we'll be talking a lot about that here later. It involves designing a system where outputs from one component become inputs for another, creating a cycle of resource utilization and regeneration. So we hear the term regenerative agriculture and these closed loop systems, and it basically just means that we're not bringing in resources that much or very little, if at all, to produce. That we on our property, we just circle this around and we use what we have to generate more and just get this closed loop system. It's easier to do with some things than it is with others. I think with soil fertility, it's actually one of the easier things to do it with. Practical benefits to closing the loop on your soil fertility. One, it saves you a lot of money. If you've ever had to buy a lot of compost or buy fertilizer for your garden or your trees, you know that can rack up pretty fast. It can be expensive, so it can save you a lot of money. It minimizes contaminant risk. Again, we'll talk about that a little bit more later with certain aspects of it, but I've heard a lot of stories of folks, especially bringing manure onto their property. It seems to happen more than anything, but I've heard it with wood chips and compost as well, that they bring something onto their property. And in the case of manure, they've usually fed their livestock like a broadleaf herbicide. And a lot of those will pass right through an animal into the manure. You take that manure, you put it on your garden soil, and most garden plants are a broadleaf plant. It won't grow, or it'll grow very, very poorly. So you minimize that contamination risk if you have a closed loop system, because you know what your animals are getting, you know what is in whatever you're putting on your soil. It ensures availability. Who knows, right? We've seen a time when things were hard to get for a short time, and who knows when that'll ever happen again. But when you got a closed loop system and for your soil fertility, you can keep your soil healthy, strong, and you don't need to be bringing things in. You don't need to be worrying about, can I get fertilizer? Can I get compost? Can I get manure? Can I get things to put on my soil? You don't have to worry about that if you are closing the loop on your soil fertility. And I remember that being a big issue. I heard that, a few years ago, about 3 years ago, we were hearing a lot about that, how farmers couldn't get fertilizer during the pandemic and stuff. So, it can be an issue, and it could be a future issue. We don't know, but again, you eliminate that problem if you have a closed loop system. It reduces waste. You'll see a slide here in a few minutes about how much waste is actually produced that doesn't have to be waste. And by creating a closed loop system, you're using a lot of that waste and not sending it to a landfill. It benefits the environment in a lot of ways. A lot of folks care about that more than others. I care about it. The less stuff that's getting shipped across the country for you to put on your garden is good for the environment. The kind of stuff a lot of people put on their gardens isn't good for the environment. A lot of these synthetic fertilizers and stuff really aren't that great. I mean, they will make your plants grow, and then they'll run off through the water systems and everything else. And it's not the best stuff. Some of it is pretty harmless. But some of it's not. And so all in all, it's better for the environment. What does soil require to grow healthy plants? I think that's important to know, because if we're going to close the loop on soil fertility, we need to know what does it take to do that? What does our soil need? Are we going to be able to produce what it needs? Because what does it actually need? So it needs, one, proper soil composition. I feel like this is really loud. I see it pegging out on red there. Proper soil composition. Minerals, organic matter, water, and air are part of that. Water drainage and retention. It has to have good soil aeration and a balanced combination of sand, silt, and clay. This is your soil texture. Essential, and it has to have essential soil nutrients, your macronutrients like your nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Those are larger quantities. That's the stuff that it needs more of. But then you have a lot of micronutrients too, your iron, manganese, zinc, a lot of others. And a lot of those are already present in the ground. It's just whether plants can uptake them or not. You have to have the right, those two things work a lot together. Actually, the next thing works with it also, which is optimal pH range. When all that stuff's working together, your plants can take up the nutrients. If those things aren't, if your soil composition isn't right, if the pH is off, it can actually affect, or if you don't have enough water retention or water drainage, if you don't have that balance in there, all these things can really affect the uptake of the plants for the nutrients. But optimal pH range is important too. Now, we don't have to worry about that one as much if we have the other two, because the other two balance that out, because most plants thrive in a slightly acidic to neutral pH range of around 6 to 7. But, specific plants, I'll just throw blueberries out there for an example. They, a little bit different. They like a little more acidic soil, and there's other things as well. But this one will generally be pretty good if the others are good. So how do you get the others good? What does it take to have a proper soil composition and make essential soil nutrients bioavailable? You got to have a good soil food web. The soil food web is what we're trying to build. Strong soil food web. Because when you have a good, strong soil food web, it does a lot for you. You'll have this proper breakdown of the organic matter. So you'll have good composition in your soil, because the life in the soil actually helps break down that organic matter, put it throughout the soil, break down the micronutrients, create micronutrients actually, and macronutrients in some cases, and make them bioavailable for the plants. So you need all of this working together. And, there's bacteria. We always think of bacteria as being this bad thing, but it isn't always a bad thing. We have a lot of good bacteria in the ground. As a matter of fact, a lot of good bacteria should, in a proper, strong soil food web, out compete the bad bacteria, even eliminate it in some cases for the most part. And fungi will do the same thing. It can play a big part in that. You have nematodes, arthropods. You have a couple different kinds there. You have different kinds of bacteria, different kinds of nematodes even, and you have the larger critters. You have your earthworms. You have your little animals and birds, and all this stuff plays a part. It all works together to create a good soil composition and a nutrient dense soil. Well, something we notice in a lot of commercial farming is the soil's fairly dead. It's not to say that there's nothing in there alive, but it gets sprayed so much and so harshly that there's not a lot of soil food web. So they just pound these fertilizers into it, make the plants grow, but are they getting the proper macro and micronutrients? Probably getting the macro, because that's why they're growing, but they're probably not getting the micro like they need to be a healthy, nutrient dense plant. So what we're going to talk about today is a few different things here that you can do to close that loop. And we're going to talk about making compost, vermicompost, compost tea, leaf mold, chop and drop. I'm throwing fish emulsion in there too, just because I want people to know how it's made. Now, whether you want to make it or not is the question, but we'll talk about that when we get to it. Biochar and livestock byproducts. There's a few things there we'll kind of mention. So we're going to start off with compost, homemade compost. This is something I feel like every homesteader should be doing. Every gardener should be doing. It's a valuable addition to the garden soil. It enriches it with essential nutrients, improves soil structure, enhances moisture retention. It acts as a slow release fertilizer. providing a steady supply of nutrients to plants. It also promotes beneficial microbial activity, which aids in nutrient cycling and disease suppression. It does everything we were just talking about your soil needs to be a good, healthy soil. So if you have a good compost, and what I mean by a good compost is a diverse compost. When you make a compost that's diverse, which I mean, not just 2 or 3 things, have a lot of things in there. Have food scraps of various kinds in there, have garden plants in there, have weeds in there, have, a lot leaves and, a lot of cardboard and paper and, all the things, you can make a strong, very diverse compost, because not all microbes feed on the same thing. Not all fungi feed on the same thing. So when you have this diverse, it has more diversity in the life. So you want to create a diverse life compost. But let's look at this first. I was telling you earlier about landfill material averages. I was looking this up just in a few different websites. And this was interesting to me that 54% of what's in landfills is actually compostable material. That's kind of shocking. 19% is recyclable material and 27% are the problem materials. Wow. I mean, we could knock out 70% of the landfill by just recycling and having a compost pile. I mean, that's pretty amazing, really. So I find that encouraging, the fact that we have that much stuff that we can compost, that we can turn into a valuable resource. That means the average home, if that's the case, that means the average home has 54% of compostable material going in their trash. You could make a lot of compost, with that. So we can eliminate that problem right there. When we talk about making compost, there's a few ways you can do it. You can, what I have is I have some pallets. These are some pictures I grabbed because I actually have a compost bin like that black one there in the picture. I have one like that, but I also have some pallets squared off, and I just got piles in there, and that's really all you need. You just need piles. You don't even need it squared off. It just looks better and it contains it, and kind of makes it a little more I don't know, just where you can keep it in one spot and it doesn't look so bad maybe. And you can even close it off to where animals can't get in there and stuff if you want to lock it up. But there's a few different ways you can do it. I mean, you notice up in the corner of this one picture here, there's a pail. Those are really nice to have. If you can keep like a little kitchen pail, they actually make them with a charcoal filter where you can just kind of not take it out till it's full, put a few scraps in there, put the lid on it. It's got like a charcoal filter in there, keeps it from smelling. And then when you get it full, take it out. That way it's not a burden. You can get something like that, or just a bucket, or just take it out as you get it. I like having the pail because it does make it easier. I don't have to make several trips a day to the compost bin. Every other day I take a pail probably out there to the compost bin of food scraps. But there's tumblers, there's some different ways to go about it, but I don't even know that that's the most important thing. I think the larger ones work better. If you can get a bigger pile, they get hotter easier, and we're going to talk about that here in just a second. How to make a hot compost pile, and why a hot compost pile is important, and maybe I'll talk about it here just a minute when we get to that, is when it's hot, it kills pathogens and some harmful things in it, and seeds. If you got anything in there that has seed in it, it can kill the seeds. And if it's got any kind of pathogens in it, it can kill pathogens, especially if you're putting manure in your compost. That can really be helpful because that tends to has a better chance of having harmful pathogens in it. So it's nice to have a hot compost pile. And so here's kind of how you do it. You find a suitable place for your compost, because a proper compost pile shouldn't stink. It should just smell kind of earthy. But if it does get out of balance a little bit, and you have to correct it, you don't want it smelling while you're trying to correct it. So it's best to have a nice, away from your house, away from maybe where you're at all the time, compost pile, but not so far away with you won't take things to it that you have. Start with a mix of greens and brown materials. So just start gathering up your greens and browns. We're not putting them in there yet because we're going to talk about that here in a second. Just gather them up, get them ready. What do I mean by greens and browns? Greens are your nitrogen rich things. These are going to be your food scraps. Are going to be nitrogen rich green, like grass, green leaves. plants and things like that you're going to throw in there. Manure is technically a green because it's high in nitrogen. Your browns are going to be like paper and cardboard and dry leaves and dead dry plants, things like that. Coffee grounds even fall into a brown actually. So I mean, it's not, you can find lists of different things if you're looking for like what is a brown, what is a green, but it's pretty, I try to just think of it as in nitrogen because alive things and food scraps tend to have a lot of nitrogen. Manure has a lot of nitrogen. Your dead stuff, nitrogen is the first thing to kind of leave a plant, so that you can kind of go by that. It's great if you can chop or shred the materials because it speeds up the decomposition process and will actually get hotter quicker. So if you can shred it, it's great. You don't have to though. It still can break down. It'll just break down quicker if you shred it. And you want to layer the green and brown materials. You want to start with the browns on the bottom and make a layer. So I'll go over here in a minute what that layer should look like. You'll want to add water to moisten the pile. It should be about as wet as a wrung out sponge. You don't want it sopping away. You don't want it dripping. I would just use a hose, get it wet, then cover it, and then just check it. And then just check it from time to time to make sure it isn't too moist. You'll want to turn the compost regularly to provide oxygen and mix the materials, because what's going to happen is going to get really hot in the middle, but your outside isn't going to get hot. So you want to turn that outside stuff in. It's the easiest thing to do with that is to have like a setup where you have multiple stages where you can flip it over to this, like the next one. Then you can get the middle on the outside in the middle, and get it breaking down, because it won't break down on that outside. It'll only break down in the middle. Monitor the temperature of the compost pile regularly. I'll show you a tool for that here in a minute. Ideally, I have here 120 to 160, 130 to 150 is where your pathogens will really die off, but it can vary from about 120 to 160 and still do a good job and get rid of most of it. Check the compost for dark, crumbly texture and an earthy smell, because that's when it's finishing. That's when you're getting this finished compost. If you look at the picture down below these little circles here, you see that that's kind of what finished compost looks like. Now you can sift that and get the larger pieces out of it and even put those in longer, but yeah, that's something what it would look like. Question: do you start the pile maintenance after you are done building it, or are you still adding scraps while you are turning the pile? That's a great question. It depends. If I'm wanting a quick compost, I gather the materials and I get a compost going, because you can actually get a finished compost in less than 3 weeks, like 2 to 3 weeks. If you've got all the materials in at once, one big pile, start turning it. You can get it really quick. If you don't care if it's a little slower, you can just add to it as you go. And I generally do that because I'm not in such a big need for a big bulk amount of compost all of a sudden, and then flip it and turn it. And then what happens is, if you have a multiple stage bin, you have like 3 stages. Say you take some pallets and you make square off one, you square off another, takes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pallets, and you make a 7 pallets, I guess. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, 7 pallets. You can make like a 3-stage bin. So you can get this one good and hot and be getting it going, then flip that over. Now you can slow down a little bit and add things to this one while that one's going. Now, when that one is really getting good, you can flip it into the third one to finish, and then you got this 3-stage. That way you're not adding new stuff to that middle stage. You're only adding it to that beginning stage. There's some different ways to do it like that. But the important thing is I like to turn them pretty regularly, and that way you can get it pretty quick. Like I say, a 3-stage in 3 weeks if you've got the stuff ready to go. I hope that answers your question there. Let me know if you need some clarification. Here's the things you really want to know about a compost pile. Your carbon to nitrogen ratio of around 30 to 1. Well, that probably doesn't mean anything to you, right? About 3 to 1 by brown and green volume. In other words, in volume, it'll look like, on average, it depends on what you put in there, because a really high nitrogen thing can adjust that, right? But on average, a 3 to 1 volume, 3 times in volume, brown to green. Okay. So if I put in, a foot of leaves, I need like what, 4 inches of dead brown leaves. I need like 4 inches of high nitrogen green, like food scraps and whatnot in the pile. If that helps you kind of break it down, and to layer it like that's a good way to start, because that'll get the process going. If you can get all that stuff kind of piled up and layer it. So like if you had say 12 inches of leaves in there, kind of fluffed in there, or cardboard or paper or whatever, and then you throw say even 4 inches of manure on that. Okay. Then another 12 inches of leaves, and and then your food scraps, and then maybe some cardboard or paper, and then some more food scraps, and build it up like that. Now you've got a really balanced compost pile that's going to start cooking pretty quick. It's going to, I mean, you get that moist now, and then you just cover that, and you check the temperature on that in just a few days, you're going to have that thing cooking pretty good. Probably within 3 or 4 days, it's going to start putting some temperatures up there. I like to even add an active, something that'll activate it, like compost or comfrey leaves. They tend to break down super, super fast, and they're high in nitrogen. So they'll actually activate it really fast and get it going faster. So that's something I do to mine to get it really cooking. The ideal temperature for hot composting is between 130 and 140. I think I said 150 earlier, but this is the range really where you're killing pathogens, which is really good if you got manure in there, or meat, or like say you're throwing your animal carcasses in there or something. Some people do. I don't, because I don't want to have like possums and raccoons and stuff trying to dig in my compost pile, and they will. I'm not afraid of it other than that, because it'll get hot enough, it'll break that down, turn it into compost. It'll just be like earth when it's done. But it, again, that manure both have a chance of pathogens, more so than other things. Maintain a moisture consistency of a wrung out sponge. I mentioned that. The compost pile should be at least about 1 cubic yard minimum, 3 by 3 by 3 feet. That should be like really the smallest. It'll do a better job of heating up if you do that. And turn the pile once a week. If you can follow those guidelines, for the most part, you're probably going to have a pretty fast acting compost pile, unless you're doing what the question said, it was adding to it as you go. And like I said, that's fine. It's just going to take a lot longer. It could take 3-4 months to get a finished compost if you're just adding a little bit at a time, turning it. That's what usually happens for me. I've created them in 3 weeks or less, and I've taken 3 or 4 months to make finished compost. It kind of goes both ways. It just depends on where I'm at and what I've got. Like in the fall, I'll have a lot of dead stuff, a lot of stuff I'm throwing in there where I've pruning stuff and whatnot. I got stuff piled up. So in the spring, everything just goes boom, takes off when it heats up, and it just goes fast. And then that second batch I make might be a lot slower, because I don't have all that fresh material piled up ready to get after it. So that's kind of gives you the gist. I hope that gives you a little bit of clarification on how to get started. There's a lot more information out there about it, but I just want to show you that it's not that hard, and that it's something that we should all probably be doing to some degree. If you can't make a big old giant 3-ring or 3-bay, just get your pile, fence it in or don't fence it in. And if nothing else, you can make a cold compost. I'm not as big a fan. There's potential of pathogens. I like to get it hot if I can. So that should help you with that. And here's the thermometer. I did want to show that too. I'll answer your question in just a second. This thermometer here will help you. You can get, it's called a compost thermometer. They're pretty long. I mean, they're really long. You can stick them, they'll get right to the center of that compost pile, and you can really get the inside temperature of that compost pile. So that's probably the only tool I would say that you should probably get if you're going to be making compost. That way, you're peaking those temperatures, and you're killing pathogens. For how long is your compost good after it is finished? It's really good as long as you keep it dry. If you're leaving it out, where it's just, here's the thing, pathogens, or I mean, not pathogens, the microbiology will wash out with rain. And if you're sitting on the ground, it can wash out. If there's nothing in there for it to eat, it will start dying after a while. I mean, I would say, I don't know exactly. I'm going to give you an I don't know answer exactly, but I would say you think about this. You go and you buy compost that's bagged up. I wonder how long that's been sitting. It still has that. It still has some microbiology working in it. It still has the biomass that's going to break down into your soil and, you know, give the microbiology in your soil something to really consume and eat, feed it. But I also think the quicker that you use it, the sooner you use it, probably the more microbial life is in there, is what I would say. So it is the case with compost tea, which we'll talk about here in a minute. But yeah, I think that would be the case. I mean, I think you could feed it even. I think you could even add like some blackstrap molasses or something to it occasionally and keep it alive, keep it generating, you know, and mix it in a little bit, just every once in a while, and probably keep it really strong, keep it really growing microbes, and that would give it something to eat. So that's just a thought. I haven't really seen that said anywhere, but that would be my thought if I was going to have it sitting for a while. Generally, I'm not producing enough of it to where I have to worry about too much of it sitting for too long. I'm generally using it pretty quick. I have a hard time making enough of it, really, which is why I started doing compost tea, because I can get a lot more bang for my buck, rather. Let's put it that way. Finished compost will obviously have the compost itself, but you'll also have something called fulvic acid and humic acid, which will play a big part in our compost tea. And I'll tell you how to extract that here in a little bit when we get to compost tea. Vermicomposting is what we'll talk about next. Vermicomposting is worm composting. It's breaking down your food scraps or manure or whatever you put in there with food scraps. I do this, and it's hard to generate quite as much unless you have a really big system, but it's very worth doing because honestly, there's probably nothing better for your garden soil than worm castings that are produced through vermicomposting. It is a very, very good inoculant for your garden soil. Benefits of vermicomposting: it produces a high quality compost, very high quality. Vermicompost is rich in nutrients, beneficial microorganisms, and humus, enhancing plant growth and soil fertility. It reduces waste. Vermicomposting diverts organic waste from landfills, reduces methane emissions, landfill space. Again, what was it? How much percentage it was that's in the landfills? Vermicompost can play a part in that as well as breaking that down. It's cost effective. Vermicomposting can be done at home in a really small tote, we'll talk about here in a second, or it can be in a bigger system. You can make a really large system or something in between. And it can provide a free source of nutrient rich compost, and it produces a high quality compost, which is the same thing I put earlier. So I messed up there. Here are some systems. There are in-home systems that you can see like this. You can buy these commercial vermicomposting bins. The stackable ones are nice because to get the flow through, they're called a flow through system, and it'll separate the worm leaching, which is the juice that kind of gets produced, this leaching, and it'll kind of drain, and you can actually use that and mix that with water, and that's a great fertilizer too. That is actually humic acid also, and you can use that in your compost tea, which we'll talk about here in a few minutes. So, but these commercial systems are great. And like I said, you could do it in a house. If you lived in an apartment, you could be vermicomposting. And if you do it properly and put the right things in there, it shouldn't smell. Usually these systems are pretty, locked up good where the worms can't escape or anything. And as long as you're keeping them fed and you're keeping it's a flow through and you're keeping the water off of them, they won't even try. They'll be happy. I have seen systems that didn't get drained, and the worms will try to get out because they're drowning in their own leachate. So you want the right kind of system. You can actually take, if you want to make your own system that works really well, a couple like Rubbermaid totes that are the same size. You can take a bottom one and set like, say, 4 or 5 bricks, say like one in each corner, maybe one in the middle, just flat in there. And then take the top one and drill a bunch of really small holes in it, and then set it down on the other one. The bricks will hold it up a little bit so it don't set down too far, and it'll keep that brick space in the bottom for it to drain. And then you can just put your food scraps and stuff in there, and your paper and your cardboard and all the again, browns and greens. They love paper and cardboard, and the moisture is about the same, like a wrung out sponge is what you want to maintain. And usually food scraps will do that. And your worms in there. Put a lid on it on the top one. You want to maybe a couple, a few holes in there just so there's going to be some airflow, and They love the dark, so you don't want no light or anything getting in there. And you can make a system like that and it'll work just great. They're a little hard to get the castings out of because you have to basically empty the entire thing, separate your worms when it's completely done, get all your castings out, got your worms over here, and rebuild it. I kind of have to do that with the system I have, which is a little bit larger system. I'll show you in a second. But you can do this really easy. This is my system I built. I used to use the Rubbermaid tote thing, and I took an old bathtub I had and I just boxed it in, framed it in, and that's mostly manure in that one. And this is when I first built it and I first put that in there. I just emptied this thing out and got these castings out of it in this tote. There's about, I don't know, probably 3-4 gallons. That's a pretty good sized tote you're looking at. So there was a few inches in that tote. And it's, like I said, I don't know how big that tote was. It was a pretty good sized tote, and it's probably that deep in there. Probably 4 gallon maybe of worm castings in there. But it took a while. It took a few months to get that. They turned that manure into worm castings. That was rabbit manure, basically, is what that was. And the worm tea, the leachate, is humic acid, like I was telling you earlier. This is worth doing as well. I think for most people, we're not going to do it on a large enough scale to supply our whole garden with worm castings. But the next thing I'm going to talk about, this makes that real useful to have some of this on your property to create a closed loop soil fertility system. And that is compost tea. If you have some good, diverse compost, nutrient-rich, microbial activity-rich compost, and you have some vermicompost, some worm castings, you have the acids from the compost pile. And here's how you'll get your humic and your fulvic acid from your compost pile. Take like a cheesecloth and take kind of that moist compost when it's good and moist in the middle. I told you about wrung out sponge. Put that in there, pour a little bit of water on it, not too much. You don't want it like dripping, and then just hang it over a bucket and tie it up and just kind of hang it over a bucket, let it drain for a while. That's all humic and fulvic acid that's coming out of your compost. And then the same thing with that leachate from your vermicompost. You can use those in your compost tea, and they work really, really well. You can use the worm castings. If you get you some netted bags, we'll talk about all this in a minute, some netted bags, the vermicompost and compost, and make your compost tea, works really well. This is my bigger system that I have. You see those little hooks hanging in my system? Those are those netted bags hanging on those hooks that I just made this out of a trash can, and it bubbles up around that. And well, I'll tell you all about that here in a second. What is compost tea? It's a liquid produced by extracting soluble nutrients, bacteria, fungi, protozoa, and nematodes from compost through a brewing process. So you're brewing it, right? What are the benefits of making and using compost tea? You impart microbial life into the soil or onto the foliage of plants, and you add soluble nutrients to the foliage or to the soil to feed the organisms and the plants present. I'm going to tell you, I didn't put something else in here that I find that I really think a big benefit is of compost tea. And that is that you can make a lot of it with very little other stuff. What I told you earlier, I can't make enough compost to feed my whole garden. I just can't produce enough. I can't produce enough vermicompost, but I can take the amount I do make, and I can make a lot of compost tea. So much that I hose my entire property down with compost tea. I mean, all of my gardens, all of my fruit tree guilds, all of my bushes, everywhere that I have anything growing of value, I put compost tea down on all that about once a month, made here on the property from stuff here on the property. So it is really valuable in that way too. That's a big benefit, that what you make can go a lot further. In other words, you can create enough soil fertility with compost tea that you can feed your soil with it. But it's good to have the compost pile, and it's good to have the vermicompost going, because they can contribute to the compost tea. And it is good to have some compost and some vermicompost, because that really can do more for the texture of your soil than just compost tea. Now we'll talk about some things later that compost tea with, say, chop and drop and biomass can do almost as good, but it's still good to have some compost to be able to add, side dress things, and it changes that tilt of that soil and that soil structure. Materials needed to make compost tea. I have a big system, but for a long time, I was just doing it with a 5-gallon bucket. Most folks are going to make it with a 5-gallon bucket. So you need a 5-gallon bucket, one of them really cheap, small aquarium air pumps that, because you want to bubble it. You want it to bubble. 2 pounds for a 5-gallon bucket. You need about 2 pounds of compost or worm castings or both. I put both in there. I might put a pound of each or a pound and a half of each in a 5-gallon bucket in a netted bag. 1 teaspoon of molasses. You can actually make your own molasses. We're talking about closed loop systems, right? I'm saying go buy molasses. If you're going to buy molasses, get the blackstrap molasses because it's more microbial rich than, because it's been purified a little bit more and thicker. It's real thick, but you can make it. You can make it out of sugar beets. You can make it out of brown sugar. You can actually make your own molasses if you want to completely close that loop. I do know that you can make it. I've looked up recipes on how to make it because I want to know how to make it again if I ever need to close that loop completely, right? 2 teaspoons of fish emulsion. I'm going to tell you a recipe for fish emulsion. You may not want to make that, but because it doesn't smell good, but you can make it. There's a recipe. I have a recipe coming up for you to make fish emulsion. And a good water source. What do I mean by a good water source? I don't mean city water. If you're in town, don't use your chlorinated water. If you do have to use chlorinated water, you want to run a bubbler in it for a couple hours and add humic acid from your compost or vermicompost in it, and then let it bubble an hour or two and try to get all that out of there and kind of get, it'll kind of bubble it out and thin it out a lot of it. It's still not the best though. It's best if you could use some rainwater or well water for this. And that's really all you need. There are other things you can add. Some people would add, and I do add like some comfrey leaves or some weed leaves, like some anything that's that I would do, like I would focus on chop and drop with, which we'll talk about here in a minute. Comfrey, your dynamic accumulator plants, dandelion leaves, plantain, dock, things like that have a lot of nutrients in their leaves because they have those real deep tap roots. So they're considered a dynamic accumulator. So anything like that you could add. You don't get a microbial release from that, but you get nutrient breakdown. It leaches the nutrients into the water. So you can make a leach. You've heard of people just doing that, probably taking a 5-gallon bucket and just packing it full of weeds and comfrey. And that works, but it's a leach. It's not a compost tea because it's compost is a broke down with microbial activity. So you're not getting that. And it's fine. It does have benefits to it, but it doesn't have as much benefit as making a compost tea that has microbial activity. There's a couple kinds of compost teas you can make. You can make one that's more fungal dominant, or make one that's more bacterial dominant. Really, the only way to know what your soil needs is to do a test with a microscope and take soil samples and look for fungal activity or look for bacterial activity and see which is lacking. There are places you can send off for those tests and get that done. I will point you to soilfoodweb.com. That's Dr. Elaine Ingham's website. She actually has a school. Basically, she teaches a course that's very expensive, but her graduates, a lot of them, do this for a living. They do soil tests with microscopes after she trains them to do it. So you can send it off to them, or you can take the classes and learn how to do it yourself and learn what your soil needs. But I try to make a balanced one. That's why I add the molasses. And it's also why I focus on having a lot of that activity. That's why I like a diverse compost pile, because it adds all of that. If you wanted one that was more fungal dominant, you wouldn't want to add the molasses, because the molasses actually is what feeds the bacteria and actually causes it to multiply. How you make it, you stick the hose of the bubbler into this. You put that stuff in a bag. Ideally, you can just put it in the water, but then you have to filter it out. You put all this stuff in the water, the 5-gallon bucket with the water, you might have to tie a rock or something onto the hose of the air pump, stick it down in the bottom, let those bubbles just bubble for about 24 hours. And then you have compost tea. That's ideally what you have. And you want to use that pretty quick. to point out the question earlier about compost, with compost tea, you do want to use it pretty fast, because when you're done at about 24 hours is when that stuff's at its peak of the microbial activity. You're going to want to use that fairly quickly. Within, I would say 24 hours, you're going to want to get that in your soil and get those microbes, living in your soil, and on your foliage. A lot of people dilute it. I don't. I spray my garden straight with it, but I make a lot of it. If I was making 5-gallon buckets of it, I would dilute it. I did. I was going like 3-to-1 water to compost tea. But I make like 50 gallons at a time now. And I literally just drop a sump pump in there with a hose and I spray it all over my garden, and I don't dilute it. And it does great. I mean, it works great. It doesn't hurt nothing. So, yeah, it works really nice. This is actually my system right now. I just took a trash can. The hose you see hooked up to the tap does not work very well, but I do like that tap I put in it with a bulkhead, because if I just want some in a bucket, because when I'm not using this for compost tea, I actually I don't know if you can see the top of it there. There's actually the gutter drain runs into it. So it collects rainwater, and I use it as rainwater collection, except for once a month when I'm going to use it for making compost tea. And I'll make compost tea for 24 hours. I'll clean it out really good. And then I put the drain back into it, the drain pipe back into it. And I use it for the rest of the month to collect rainwater. I have an air pump. Now for this system, I have a way bigger air pump. It's, it's probably that big. It looks like a little mini air compressor, and it turns some big bubbles, as you can see in that one picture, and it goes down through that PVC pipe and it makes big giant bubbles, and it really works that water, because you're actually knocking the microbial activity off of the compost that's in those bags. So that's how that works. And it's just busting it out, and it's getting it in the water where you have the molasses and everything, and it's just feeding it, and it's really thick in that water. And it works really well, and it makes a really good compost tea. And I can do this once a month. Now in this system, I have to use I generally throw about 10 pounds of compost in a bag and about 5 pounds of vermicompost in a bag. And then I also put a bag of comfrey leaves and maybe some dandelion or whatever in there also. And so I've got a lot of stuff bubbling in there. Plus I put the fish emulsion, the molasses. I actually put some liquid kelp in this too, and then bubble it. So yeah, that's how I do this one. And it works really, really well. As you can see, it's pretty simple though. It's not a hard system to build. Any questions about compost tea, you can throw them out there. But I think if you're making compost and you're making vermicompost, you should be making compost tea as well, because it'll go a lot further on your property and feed your soil really, really well. Leaf mold is another thing you can do to close the loop on your soil fertility. Making leaf mold is super, super easy. What is leaf mold? It's when leaves break down slowly in a natural fungal driven process. When you add leaves to your compost pile, you're breaking them down in predominantly a bacterial driven process really fast. But when they break down in a fungal driven process, it makes a completely different animal. It does have some microbial activity, but it's mostly fungal activity. And it also makes it fluffy. I mean, I don't know a better word for it. It just makes it fluffy. If you want like really aerated soil with really good water retention, has the proper amount of water retention, but good drainage, leaf mold is really good. Question: why can't the compost be loose in the bucket? What purpose do the bags serve? It's a great question. I said you can put it in there loose. You absolutely can. But then you have to filter it out. You could just dump it. I mean, if you just took in 5 big gallon buckets, you just dump it on your property like that, right? What you generally, when you're applying the compost tea though to your property, you're going to put it in a sprayer. If you're doing it with buckets, you're going to probably dilute it, put it in a sprayer. So you're going to have to filter all that out. It saves the filtering process. For me, I don't want to do it even in my big system, because I'm dropping a sump pump in there. I don't want it plugging up my sump pump. So I can just take all that out and it's just clean. I don't have to worry about that being in my water. You absolutely can. Yeah, you absolutely can. Just put it in there loose, bubble it, let it turn 24 hours. You could pour that directly on with the all that stuff too if you wanted, but it won't go as far. If you want to dilute it and put it in a sprayer, you're going to have to, You have to screen all that stuff out of there. So that's the purpose. I hope that answers your question. It just, yeah, it just filters it basically. But anyway, the leaf mold takes the place of, I think it does a good job of taking the place of some things I don't like using, like peat, using peat, sorghum peat, sagum peat, whatever it's called, the peat moss, because it's not the most environmentally friendly thing to use because of peat bogs. And I don't know, you'd have to do your own research on that, and I'll let you kind of get into that. But we're actually destroying a lot of the peat bogs in the world, and it is causing a little bit of an environmental disaster. So we don't need it though. We don't need to bring that onto our property. We don't need to be bringing something in from, thousands of miles away to our property. When we have leaf mold, it serves in a lot the same way. It won't do the pH difference that peat will do, but it makes very good fluffy soil. Leaf mold is great. I love it. Benefits of leaf mold: it helps with, as I mentioned, it helps with moisture retention by improving the tilth. It improves and aerates the soil structure, and it increases the beneficial microorganisms. It has some microorganisms in it, but it also creates an environment that's very microorganism friendly, because you got that nice aerated, fluffy soil. Microorganisms live really well in that, and they do a better job of doing their job, and that's making that soil to where the micronutrients in it are bioavailable to the plants, which is a big part of the microorganisms. So the proper soil texture, leaf mold does a really good job of that. So it all contributes to that. How to make leaf mold? The good news is leaf mold makes itself. The bad news is it takes a long time because it's a slow process. It's like when you walk into a forest, and you see that the broke down leaves in a forest, and you go under those top leaves and you see that really crumbly, fluffy, real earthy smelling stuff. That's leaf mold on a thick floor of leaves in the forest. But it takes a long time. It can take several months, maybe a year, really to break down good. You can speed up the process though by shredding the leaves real finely. If you get a leaf shredder, one of them hoppers, you just drop the leaves in, it shreds them real fine. They actually break down a lot faster. They will actually break down quicker in your compost if you do that too, and make your compost break down quicker and give you a quicker compost. So one of those is actually a nice thing to have. I have one on my chipper, and just for leaves. It's got a leaf hopper also. Does a great job of breaking things down. Well, all you have to do is basically just set up like a fence. Like takes a piece of fencing, like 4-foot fencing, make a circle with it, wire it together, fill it full of leaves or shredded leaves. Shred them if you want, or just fill it full of leaves and forget about it for a while, several months. And when you come back, those will be broke down so crumbly that that'll work right into your soil really well. You can add it right to the top of the soil. The worms and the activity and the critters there will work it down into the soil. So you can almost use it like side dressing with compost. It works really, really good. The next thing you can do is chop and drop. If you're into permaculture, you know what chop and drop is, but if you don't, it isn't just permaculture, because we do a lot of chop and drop. So different forms of chop and drop: chopping and dropping while pruning. When I'm out there cutting, things back, if I'm pruning anything, I chop it up. I just take my pruners and I just chop it into a few little pieces and I drop it. The only time I won't do that is if there's a disease issue on the plant, like there's say there's some leaves that maybe have some mildew on them, some powdery mildew on them, or they look like they have some kind of disease or something off of a tree. I wouldn't put that in my compost pile either. I would probably bag that up and remove that, or burn it and get it off my property. Just burn it or something in a wood stove, which we can talk about here in a few minutes. Other than that, I would chop and drop it. Seeds would be another issue. If it has a lot of seeds, I wouldn't chop and drop it, because you're spreading your seeds around and you might get some things you don't want. Generally with trees and early plants, that's not a big issue. But chop and drop while you're pruning. Chopping and dropping cover crops. If you practice growing cover crops to in between your plantings of your annual vegetables, that's what you're doing. When you're done, before those go to seed, you chop them, you drop them, and you let that break down into the soil. That's a chop and drop. Mulching with wood chips or other biomass is actually chop and drop. What are wood chips? They're just chopped up wood, right? Chopped up limbs. So if you have a, say, chipper shredder and you're grinding them up and you're dropping those wood chips that mulch on your garden, that's a chop and drop that feeds the soil. This microbial activity and the macro and micro organisms, they'll take that down into the soil and feed it. And then there's a thing called mow and blow. I actually wasn't too familiar with this term until just recently when I was interviewing somebody on my podcast. Helen Ahow talks about, she's a market gardener. I mean, she grows everything in long rows, right? She has orchards and she has these long rows of annual vegetables. And what she does is she lets the weeds kind of grow in between the rows. She doesn't worry about maintaining the paths. And then she just goes down through there with a riding lawnmower and she just blows the grass and the weeds all around. You know, this is after her plants have grown somewhat. She won't do it over seedlings or nothing, but once they get up there, she blows it and it just basically mulches around the plants and creates this great biomass that breaks down, feeds the microorganisms, works out fantastic for her. Actually suppresses the weeds right around the plants so she don't get any weed pressure competing with her vegetables. And you get this breakdown of microbial activity. It works really good for her. So that was mow and blow is another form of chop and drop. But anyway, chop and drop. I did want to say, let me go back here. Chop and drop. I mentioned earlier about compost will give you that, on just a second here. Sorry about that. I had to look at something real quick. Chop and drop or compost will give you that something that compost tea won't, which is it will give you, some structure to your soil. It can give you a little bit of structure because you get more increased microbial activity, right? Well, how you end up getting the structure that you would get with compost if you do a lot of chop and drop and you put compost tea on it, the microbial activity really increases and it breaks down that chop and drop really fast. And you get that same compost effect. You still get that work down into the soil and you get that fluffy soil. You start putting leaf mold down, you put your chop and drop down, you put the compost tea on that. It will give you the same effect for the most part as putting down layers of compost on your garden. So you can kind of get it. So even if you can't produce tons of compost and vermicompost to get that in your soil, you can do that instead. And in addition to get more and create really good soil texture, even with compost tea. So on to the next thing, which is fish emulsion. I told you I just want to tell you what that is in case you want to close the loop on fish emulsion, because fish emulsion has some really good qualities for when you need it, because some things in your garden are really heavy nitrogen feeders. Well, what is fish emulsion? Fish emulsion is fermented organic garden fertilizer that is made from whole fish or parts of fish, and it provides an NPK ratio, which is your nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, 4:1:1, which means it's got 4 times the nitrogen that has these other things in it. So it's most often used to provide a quick nitrogen boost. Compost tea, things can provide chop and drop, even with like comfrey leaves that have a lot of nitrogen. They are more of a slow release nitrogen. Fish emulsion is a fast release nitrogen. So for example, if I'm wanting to do a succession planting of something that I've just planted, say I'm doing brassicas. Brassicas are very heavy feeders. They're really high nitrogen feeders. If I'm wanting to get 2 plantings of brassicas, I might want to make a fish emulsion spray to put down in between my plantings to boost that soil with nitrogen for the next crop to go in. Tomatoes, peppers, it depends on where you live. You might get a couple crops out of other things that are high nitrogen feeders. But you can see where it would be useful. It's also really good to add a little bit to your compost tea. So it's good to know how to make. I'll be honest, I don't make it. It smells really bad. When you buy it, I buy a nice little bottle of it and it goes a long way because you're only using a couple tablespoons of it in your compost tea. So it goes a long, long way. But I think it's important that we know how to make these things and what they are, and then you can make them. How to make fish emulsion. In a 5-gallon bucket, you take 4 to 5 pounds of chopped up fish parts. Yep, that's right. 2 tablespoons of lactobacillus. That's fermenting. Like you make sauerkraut, for example. Okay, if you're fermenting any vegetable, take some of that liquid after it's fermented. That's all you need. 2 tablespoons of that. That's your lactobacilli. Water from a good source. I already told you what that was. That's rainwater, well water, not city water. Your water, you're going to have about 3 times the water per fish part. So if you've got this much fish parts filled up with water, right? So you just the rest of it water. 1 cup of molasses that gets the microbial activity going. And you'll want to stir it daily after about 2 weeks for about 2 more weeks, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, somewhere around there, and stir it daily after a couple weeks after it sits. You're going to want to put a lid on it because it's going to stink. Have you a nice stick ready to stick in there. It's going to smell bad, but that's how you make fish emulsion. And that's what you buy. You buy that liquid. You'll strain all those pieces out. You keep the liquid. The good news is you can make a 5-gallon bucket of it like that, and it would last you a long, long time because you're only using, you put that in a bottle, seal it up. You're going to use that for several months. So again, you can close the loop on your soil fertility by making some fish emulsion, and it'd be a really good high quality nitrogen booster. When you're applying it, did I put that in here? I didn't. When you're applying it, you only want a couple tablespoons to like a gallon of water. It doesn't take much. It, I wouldn't put more than, maybe a quarter cup in a gallon of water at the most. And it'll be a nice little nitrogen boost for your plants. You can spray it in the foliage. You can spray it on the soil in between plantings or around plants that need more nitrogen and do really good for you. Or it's just nice to have to add to your compost tea. Next, we're going to talk about biochar. I'm going to talk about biochar with a little bit of a caveat here. I'm fairly new to it. I just started making it in the last couple months. Been doing a little bit of homework on it though, and I see the value of it. I'm making some. I've been making some for the last few weeks, and I hear really good things about it. Really good things about it. As far as adding to your soil, adding to your compost, and making a place for your microbial activity to be there longer and more of it. So what is biochar? A specific type of charcoal that is made when an organic matter like wood chips is heated in the absence of oxygen. There's a name for it. I'm not going to use the name because I don't know how to pronounce it. It is then activated with microbial activity. So what does all that mean? The benefits of biochar: it provides a secure habitat for microorganisms and fungi. It is good for nutrient retention, water retention, and overall soil fertility, lasting longer. It improves plant growth and enhances crop yields. Folks, I've seen statistics on this, like studies done on this, through like government websites and like colleges and stuff that's done some studies on this. It's amazing. They've been showing the increases in yields that are using biochar, the increases in microbial activity using biochar, and it made me go, wow, I got to be using biochar. I got to be adding it to things because over time it will do wonders for your soil. So I think it's an important thing to use. But it isn't something I've been using, but I think it can do a lot for our soil, and it's something we should be using. This is the biochar kiln that I built, and it's not ideal. And I'll tell you why, because I read in the description of what it is. It's oxygen. You want to do it in an oxygen-free environment. Well, this barrel stove I built this out of what I already had. I already had this barrel stove in my garage. I wasn't using it anymore. So I cut a hole in it, and I had this little campfire stove. This is a camp stove, and I just set it down in there. But I take it out and I pack it full of hardwood that I'm going to make the biochar out of. And then I can just use whatever I want below it, pallet wood or softwood or whatever, and I build a fire underneath of it. And what I don't want though is I don't want a lot of oxygen. Really don't want any oxygen getting into that little stove, but some does. Because when some oxygen gets in there, it doesn't just char the wood, it actually burns it up a little bit. You'll see some ash being produced instead of just charcoal. So I get a little bit of ash because there's a little bit of oxygen getting around the front door of that stove. If I could seal it off better, it would work perfect. I built a fire under it, and a few hours later, I let the fire go out a couple hours later, and then I just kind of let it sit and simmer. And then I get some nice looking biochar or some char out of that little stove. But then you have to inoculate it. Well, what do you inoculate out of it to make it biochar? You soak it in compost tea, or you can actually just make it with compost tea. I mean, you can just put the stuff in there. You make compost tea in some water while it's in there, and you saturate it for a few days, let it get the molasses going and get the microbial activity going, and it packs it full of microbes. And this sounds crazy to me, but I heard like a little piece of biochar has the same surface area because it has all these layers in it, so many layers, because it makes these really fine little layers all the way through it, has the same surface area as like a football field. Ask me how that's possible. I don't know, but I've read that in like several places that that little piece of biochar has like all this area for microbial activity to live on, because that's how small the microbial activity is. So putting that out there, it holds it, it gives it a place to live. It won't be washed away. It won't go away. It stays in your soil. Plus it contributes to the texture of your soil, the tilth of your soil, that makes great soil. So, that's what I know about biochar. Again, I think it's worth making. You're going to learn more about that in other places until I get more versed in it myself. But I've been making quite a bit of it lately, and I've been adding it to my compost, and I've actually got plenty for my compost, but I'm going to start adding it directly into my garden beds and working it into the soil this fall. So I'm creating even more for that. But yeah, biochar, I'm hearing so many good things about it. And yeah, I think it's something we should be making that contributes to our closed loop soil fertility. The last thing I want to talk about is livestock byproducts. Livestock byproducts are things produced by your livestock. What livestock byproducts can benefit the soil? Manure, of course, bone meal, blood meal, feathers, hides, eggshells, all this stuff. I mean, you process your animals, all that can go into a compost. It can go in your vermicompost. It can go directly in a garden. A lot of it can. You can make things out of it that can go in your garden. I mentioned earlier about manure. I think it's worth having animals, even if you don't want to raise animals for meat. If you just want to raise them for their manure, having some rabbits for their manure is fantastic. Because if you bring in manure on your property, you're risking contamination. You don't have to have manure. I'm just saying, if you was planning on bringing in manure, it's great to just have your own manure. So having animals can play a big part in closing that loop in soil fertility. If you do process your animals, you can make bone meal. Bone meal is just dried, ground up, powdered bone is all it is. And it's rich in potassium, phosphorus. I can't remember. Phosphorus, I think, actually. Blood meal is rich in nitrogen. You make that from blood. It's dried blood, powdered up. That's what it is. Just dried, powdered blood meal. Really rich in nitrogen. Feathers, I can't remember what they have, but they're great. You can throw them right in your compost and they break down, and they have great stuff in them. I should have put a little more work into putting this together, but all this stuff has things that your soil needs. Eggshells have calcium, and it's more of a micronutrients breaking down. All these things, and they all have micronutrients as well. All this can break down your compost, and some of it can be added directly to your garden. Some cold manures like rabbit and goat can be put directly in a garden bed. All others that I know of need to be broke down in compost or aged. I think horse manure can just be aged, but composted is best to add to your garden. And yeah, these are things you can do to continue to close that loop on soil fertility. Like I said, there's plenty of things you can do if you don't want animals, you don't want to mess with animals, you don't want to do any of this. I think you can still close the loop with the other stuff just fine. But I think having animal byproducts, livestock byproduct to benefit the soil is an added addition to the soil. And if you're running tractors, you can do it while you're moving your animals. They can contribute it right to the ground directly in a lot of ways. So yeah, these are all things you can do with livestock byproducts. So folks, that is the entire thing on closing the loop on soil fertility. There are other things out there you can do. There really are. I didn't exhaust a list on things you could do to feed your soil, but these are some easy ways I think that most of us can do most of these things. And we can create a closed loop system for our soil fertility and not have to buy fertilizer, not have to risk contamination, and have availability and have all those benefits of having a closed loop system on your soil. I'm big on closed loop systems on every aspect of my homestead, but life starts at the soil. It really does. Our plants grow to feed us from that soil. If we're going to raise livestock feed to create a closed loop with our livestock, it starts with the soil. If we're going to do anything really, it starts with our soil on our homestead. So we need good, rich, nutrient dense, heavy microbial activity soil, fungally rich also soil to feed our plants and provide the healthiest food for us, our livestock, and everything we need right from our lands.